Good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. Good morning and good evening for those of you around the world. I'm Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service, and I'm happy to be hosting the latest Fast Break. We had intended this as an occasional series, but it's now turned into almost a weekly series, given the number of extraordinary, unexpected events around the world. And today, we're particularly pleased to be talking about a set of events that really did stun the foreign policy community, stun the world, and raise tremendously interesting questions about the future of the Middle East and engagement around the world. Yes, we're talking about Syria today, and we are here with Dr. Nader Hashemi. Dr. Hashemi is the director of our Alwaleed Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding here at SFS, and he's an associate professor of Middle East and Islamic politics. He was previously the founding director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the Korbel School of International Affairs at the University of Denver. His research lies in numerous different areas, but in particular the intersection of comparative politics and political theory and the global rise of authoritarianism. He's author of several books, including Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy. He's author of The Syria Dilemma, Sectarianism, Mapping the New Politics of the Middle East, and editor of a 4-volume study of Islam and human rights, critical concepts in Islamic studies. And he's been frequently interviewed across multiple venues here in Europe and in the Middle East. So it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you very much, Dr. Hashemi. For those of you who haven't been in one of our sessions before, I will start the questions. We do take questions during the conversation through the Q&A function, which I will try to integrate into the conversation as it progresses. And we will keep to a half hour and make this lunch break for those of you who are enjoying lunch during this session. So look, let's start with the big question. What an extraordinary set of events in Syria. And we are going to be focusing on a forward-looking analysis of what does this mean for the future of Syria? What does it mean for the future of the Middle East? There are so many players involved in this multifaceted set of events. Of course, we've got the Syrian National Army backed by Turkey and HTS, still labeled a terrorist organization by the United States. We've got the Syrian Democratic Forces led by the allied with the United States against ISIS. We've got, of course, the historic tensions between Turkey and the Kurds, which are impacting the Turkey's involvement in this. We've had American airstrikes in central Syria over the last several days, hundreds of airstrikes from Israel over the last several days. And yet we still have 2 Russian bases remaining in Syria, although there are some signs of retreat. And obviously, we've also heard about Iran retreating. So this is an extraordinary cornucopia of actors in an extraordinary session. Can you tell us really, where do you see the leadership? How do you see this unfolding in terms of the multiple players? Who do you think really will be leading the dialogue and engagement, not only within Syria, but outside Syria?
Well, thanks, Joel, first of all, for the invitation. Yeah, this is a story that has many moving parts. But in terms of your question, it's clear that it's this guy by the name of Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, which is his nom de guerre. He goes by the name now of, Ahmad al-Shara, the leader of the HTS, the rebel movement, that is very much the person in charge of Syria, at least for the foreseeable future. What happens down the road is yet to be determined. And I think he's trying to reinvent himself, to move away from his extremist past, where he had an affiliation with al-Qaeda and ISIS, and to brand himself as a Syrian leader representing a new vision for the future of Syria post-Assad that will bring Syrians together. What we don't know are all these sort of very important questions about, what does citizenship look like in this new Syria going forward in terms of the status of women, minorities? What role will religion have, given the fact that al-Jawlani comes from a deeply conservative religious background? These are all questions that remain to be ascertained. But I just want to highlight the fact that we are still in the very early phases of this monumental transformation in Syria, where one of the big challenges of this new government that's being established is simply to provide some sort of stability in a transitional period. But as you rightly noted, Joel, one of the challenges going forward is that Syria, in many ways, is is a broken patchwork of a country where the central government doesn't lay sovereign claim over its own territory because there's so many external actors that are there. Iran has now sort of departed. Russia looks like it's on its way out. But as you mentioned, Israel is still very much involved in the game, bombing Syria, taking new territory. The United States effectively controls, I would argue, 1/3 of Syria in coalition with Kurdish forces. And then, Turkey is in many ways a major player today. And I would also argue the big winner in this transformation that we're talking about.
Well, let's stick with that first, and I want to go through the various players that are there. So Turkey is the big winner. Talk a little bit about what Turkey hopes to see from this transition and how Turkey will deal with a very complicated relationship with the Kurds, because the Kurds played obviously a critical role in the downfall of the Assad regime. And the United States is supporting the Kurds, given the tension between Turkey and Kurdish separatists. With the U.S. supporting the Kurds, where does that put Turkey in a potentially an uncomfortable position with the United States? Talk a little bit about Turkey as the big winner and how it plays out its engagement in Syria, given their concerns about Kurdish separatism.
So that's been an ongoing theme in Turkish politics, Turkish foreign policy. It wants to prevent the emergence of any sort of independent Kurdish autonomy movement. The Kurds around the Middle East, including in Syria, they want autonomy, they want independence. They're very open about it. But they're facing a very aggressive Turkey that wants to prevent that from happening, because the largest population of Kurds in the Middle East lie in Turkey. And there's been a long-standing conflict there between the Turkish central government and Kurdish separatists. So this is an ongoing story. And I think what Turkey is hoping to do is position itself with this new government to have leverage over this new government emerging in Damascus to prevent any sort of increase in power of the Kurdish separatists that are in eastern Syria. This is an ongoing problem. But I think the bigger sort of question here is, what Turkey is hoping to gain from this change of events in its neighboring country. And in many ways, Turkey is the big winner, because Turkey has for a very long time invested in supporting these Syrian opposition groups, hoping that if there was going to be a political change in Syria, it would be able to have influence. That looked like it was happening in the early days of the Arab Spring, 2011, 2012, 2013. But when Assad was able to defeat the rebels and defeat his opponents and consolidate power, Turkey's big investment in supporting these opposition groups looked like it was a bargain that didn't pay any dividends. Just before this big change of events, Turkey was interested in actually reaching out to the Assad regime and trying to mend fences. The Assad regime was sending back signals. No, they didn't want to compromise. There was nothing to be gained by talking to Turkey. In many ways, that could be Assad's biggest mistake, because Assad's refusal to engage with Turkey effectively, created a situation where these Syrian rebel groups were able to launch an offensive, basically with Turkish support, and surprisingly take over the capital city and depose the regime in roughly 12 days. So Turkey is hoping to be sort of the big brother here, to benefit from any economic reconstruction, for really being this new rebel government's gateway to the outside world, through support of its Turkish sort of patron, if you will. And this is sort of, if you listen to just what Turkey is saying, you can almost see it's jubilation and excitement, but it's also a huge risk for Turkey, because if things go wrong in Syria, if it becomes another Afghanistan, the blowback effect on Turkey will be dramatic, given the nature of of the relationship and the long border that they share. The other thing that Turkey is very interested in doing is seeing the 4 million Syrian refugees that are in Turkey repatriated. This has become a bone of contention in Turkish politics. In fact, the last elections that we had in Turkey, this issue of the major, Syrian refugee population became a club that the opposition was using to, discredit Erdogan. And so I think Erdogan is hoping that one of the things that's going to happen here is that these millions of Syrian refugees will go back to Turkey, alleviating the pressure on him domestically. But of course, that's conditional on just what type of political order emerges in Turkey going forward, economically, politically. I mean, a lot of these refugees have no homes to go back to. And if you know what's happening in Syria today, it is an economic catastrophe. It's a basket case. I was just looking at figures the other day. The UNHCR says 90% of the Syrian people survive on humanitarian aid. There's no infrastructure. There's no jobs. It's going to take a long time in the best case scenario for Syria to get its economic and political house in order for these refugees to return. But Turkey is hoping to sort of manage that and be the biggest beneficiary of these changes that we're talking about.
Does this place Turkey in an awkward situation with the United States, or vice versa, I should say, perhaps, since the United States is supporting the Kurds? The United States has, what, about 900 troops stationed in Kurdish areas. Kurdish separatism is a part of the reason why Turkey is so engaged in this. Does it put them at least in tension with the U.S., or do you see this resolving itself?
No, it's the tension is obvious there because the United States has relationships with both sides. It's working directly with these Kurdish groups in Syria, and it also has a relationship with the Turkish government. Turkey's a NATO country. The United States has a longstanding, but this is not a new story, Joel, because the United States and Turkey have been in tension over this question of Kurdish rights, Kurdish separatism for a very long time. In Iraq, when the United States entered Iraq after 2003, and now in the context of Syria and the war against ISIS. So it's a relationship the United States tries to manage. The United States both needs these Turkish sort of separatist groups to do the heavy lifting in the fight against ISIS, but at the same time, that relationship antagonizes the Turkish central government, which doesn't like this relationship and wants to make sure that Turkish separatist aspirations are very much kept in check. So this is actually an important balancing act and role of diplomacy that the United States has to play, and making sure that these two things coexist and they don't sort of explode. And it's going to be a challenge going forward as the situation in Syria unfolds.
Now, we've got some questions about Russia. What's happening to Russian presence there? What's happening to the two bases? And you might also say something about what's happening to Iran's presence there.
So I think Iran's presence is easy to talk about. There is no Iran presence anymore. If you talk to Syrian opposition groups, Iran was viewed as an occupying power in Syria. There's a lot of loathing and anger and understandable, hatred for the propping up of the Assad regime. If you know the story of the Arab Spring, it looked like in 2015 that the Assad regime was about to be toppled. It was because of the role that Iran and Russia played, basically keeping that regime going. So I think Iran's influence in Syria is over, and this has huge consequences because Syria was the conduit for Iran to support Hezbollah in Lebanon. That story is now over. It's a major strategic defeat, and if you follow what's happening in Iran today, there's just a lot of confusion, anger, and mutual recriminations in Tehran. How did this happen? Why didn't we prevent it? So Iran is part of Syria's past, not its future. Russia is a different story. If you listen to what the Syrian rebel groups and leaders are saying about Russia, they realize that Russia is a great power. They realize that Russia has played a very destructive role in recent Syrian history and politics. And I think they're trying to figure out what to do next. One of the objective sort of reference points here is that, Russia has been propping up the Assad regime, but Russia has a seat at the Security Council. Russia is a major power. It seems like there's an attempt to try and figure out a new relationship with Russia. I've been hearing and reading reports that the new Syrian government might be willing to honor the existence of this agreement where Russia is allowed to keep a naval port in exchange for some sort of economic conditions to be worked out. But I think its military, its air base that it's had will probably have to be dismantled. I think that's one option. But of course, casting a shadow over Russia's relationship in Syria is the fact that Bashar al-Assad fled to Moscow. And there's going to be strong societal pressure to have him returned. And I could easily see people in Syria saying, look, if Russia wants to stay and have that naval base, it's going to have to return Assad, to Syria to face trial. So this is going to be part of the dynamics of figuring out a future relationship with Russia going forward.
So look, while this is all happening and all these complex dynamics are occurring, the United States has been engaged in airstrikes, direct airstrikes during this transition. Israel has been engaged in what can only be described as massive airstrikes, estimates of well over 400, perhaps even as many as 800 airstrikes. So in a situation of this fluidity, where you have direct military action, going on from two different powers, from America and Israel, to what extent does this set up a potentially unstable situation for this new government to adjust to? And then I'd love you, and already there's a question regarding, does this instability first the multiple powers and the fact that there is military action ongoing, does it kind of create a greater opening for a return to fundamentalism or more radical engagements that we know have been part of the past of some of these rebel groups?
Yeah, those are great questions. Look, I think the American airstrikes and the Israeli airstrikes, which I think are much more punitive and much more destructive, are destabilizing a very fragile situation. The American airstrikes are in eastern Syria. They're geared toward rolling back and crushing a resurgence ISIS. That's fundamentally what they're about. But because they're happening in this new period when Assad is no longer in power, and as far as I know, they're not being coordinated by this new government that's emerging, it sends a message that Syria is still not a country that can lay sovereign claim over its own territory. There are these outside actors. The United States bombs eastern Syria at its will without any coordination with what's happening in Damascus. Turkey occupies a huge section of northern Syria. And Israel now is doing, I think, something that's far more destructive, because effectively what it's doing, it's destroying the armed forces of the Syrian state, Navy, Air Force, and military. And it's doing it in such a comprehensive way that it raises questions about when this new Syrian government emerges, how can it then fight ISIS should ISIS reemerge? It has no military, Air Force, or Navy left because it's effectively been destroyed by Israel. And of course, the backstory here is that Israel is in foreign occupation of Syrian territory going back to the 1967 war. Israel has expanded its control over the Golan Heights recently since the toppling of Assad. And there's reports of, Israeli commandos and military going way beyond the Golan Heights area, in the close vicinity of Damascus. So all of this sets up a situation where the biggest challenge, I think, facing the new governmental regime in Damascus is how can it establish sovereign control over its own territory when you have basically these three powers, one international power, two regional powers that intervene and can sort of bomb and control parts of Syrian territory at its will. I think this is going to be a big challenge going forward. I think it's going to create tensions. I think the biggest tension really is going to be more on the Israeli side, because Israel is viewed by people in Syria as a colonial settler state that's engaging in gross repression in Gaza and is occupying Syrian territory. And not only is it occupying Syrian territory, but in 1981, Israel annexed the Golan Heights, and now it's talking about sending more settlers into the Golan Heights. So what's interesting, though, is that there was an interview that was given last week where the spokesperson for this new HTS rebel movement was asked to comment on the Israeli airstrikes in Syria. And it was clear he didn't want to engage and say anything critical. But when the reporter from Channel 4 News in England kept pressing the issue, he kept the spokesperson for the new rebel government kept dodging the question. And I was actually shocked that he couldn't simply, affirm and say clearly, we reject and oppose these airstrikes. That told me that I think this new government is very much trying to cater to the West, cater to this new reality where it doesn't want to offend the United States in particular, and it wants very much to have recognition from the West. It wants these sanctions lifted. It wants this terrorism label sort of revoked, and that's why it's basically staying quiet on the question of what Israel is doing. I did find out recently that at the United Nations, the new Syrian government has filed a formal petition at the UN for what Israel is doing, and using that sort of backroom channel to protest, but they're not doing it publicly. And I think this all speaks to the question that you posed, Joel, about the future orientation of this rebel group, which comes out of a deeply conservative, Islamist perspective that has ideological affinities with what most people might know as Wahhabi Islam. We don't have a clear platform for what this new rebel leader and group is going to stand for, but we do have some evidence to sort of project forward. For the last roughly 5 or 6 years, the HTS have been running Idlib province in northern Syria. They've effectively been the governing authority. They've set up this thing called the Syrian Salvation Front, where they were basically running the institutions of the state, schools, providing basic services. And if you look at what they were doing in that province, there's a lot of cause for concern with respect to basic human rights. There was a UN report that was put out in August of this year that talks about the repression, talks about sort of the draconian authoritarian style of governance that Jolani was presiding over. There's a Human Rights Watch report. There's an Amnesty report. There's a lot to be concerned about. But there's also a new reality. And so, the good news is that since coming to power, Jolani has been saying all the right things about unity, toleration, respecting minorities. But we don't know how far that's going to go. I think one of the big questions is what happens in the next few months. The official plan for this rebel government is that they're going to preside over a period of transition until March, and then there would be some sort of national, I'm hoping, dialogue or discussion or plan for elections that would, bring other parties into the conversation. That remains to be seen. I suspect one of the most likely outcomes would be the new rebels saying, look, the situation is so precarious, unstable, we can't transition after March. We still have to sort of keep things going as they are. And they'll be very reluctant to incorporate new people into the decision-making process. I hope I'm wrong. I mean, I think the best case scenario here would be for the HDS to say, look, we're forming a political party. We're going to have elections. We encourage other people to form political parties. Let the population decide who's going to be the new leader of this country. And then, that would be the basis for a new post-Assad Syria. I'm skeptical that the HDS, given their background, are going to be that interested in sharing power or relinquishing power. But the good part of it is that I think the pressure from the international community demanding as a consequence or a condition for recognition and new relations that Syria has to have a new government that respects minorities, but also is representative. I think those are good external sort of constraints that are being imposed on this new regime that's taking form in Damascus that could perhaps push things in a better direction.
In addition to the constraints that you mentioned, what about the kind of positive support? What is the likelihood of some of these players, the United States in particular, under the new administration, the Turkish authorities, providing the financial support that might be necessary? As you said, this has been a devastating era, the civil war for Syria. You've got the possibility of large-scale return of migrants back into Syria. You've got the possibility of supporting a political normalization process. You've got the rebuilding of some of their military capacity if that becomes necessary in order to deal with some of the challenges they're facing. Where's this support going to come from?
I think probably Turkey will have probably its own agenda and be very willing to sort of be the lead country. What I'm hearing from the HTS and from Jolani and his crowd is that they very much want international recognition. They want the lifting of sanctions. They want foreign investment. How far they're willing to go to have that remains to be seen. I think there's a huge role for the international community to play. One of the complicating factors here is, the neighboring Arab states. They have a lot of financial resources, but they're viewing the situation in Syria with a lot of concern because they don't like the fact that an Arab dictator has been toppled by a political Islamist group that has a different vision for the future. So that's a complicating. I suspect those Arab countries will be very reluctant to invest in a new Syria, given what we're seeing right now.
So far, they're staying on the sidelines. I did see Qatar is reopening its presence there.
Yep.
But what you see is on the other Arab nations are staying on the sidelines so far.
Yeah, especially the Emirates. If you look what the Emirates is saying, they're very concerned, very worried. I suspect Saudi Arabia as well. Qatar is always sort of has a different agenda here. It tries to sort of be the mediator in the region, the country that can have relationships with everyone. But I was referring specifically to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. They're very worried about what they're seeing in Syria today.
Talk a little bit about the U.S. diplomatic role. So Blinken was in the region, and it does look like the early signs are that the U.S. has been trying to broker some sense of engagement across the numerous parties, obviously not with Russia and Iran. Talk a little bit about what you know from the Blinken visit and where you see American diplomacy influencing the shape of things to come.
Well, the United States is the one country that has the relationships with most of the key players. Israel, Turkey, the Arab states. Hearing what I'm hearing coming out of Washington, D.C., the White House in particular, they have a deep interest in presiding over a stable transition. It's not in the American interest to see things break apart and to see another war get reignited. So I think they're trying to talk to. There's a position now that Blinken just yesterday at his press conference says we've already been in contact with the new rebel leader of the government. So there's been a dialogue there, a dialogue with Jordan, with Turkey, and I suspect with other Arab allies in the region, and also with Israel. So trying to figure out how to manage, I think, this period of transition, so things don't go awry. You don't see a breakdown in political order. I think is something that the United States is trying to manage. And there's a lot of moving balls. There's the Kurds. There's the Arab states that don't like what's happening. There's Turkey that has a major role. And then there's Israel's interest. So the United States is the one country that's trying to manage all this. With Trump coming in, I don't have any confidence the new Trump foreign policy team can pull this off. It remains to be seen, but that's going to be, I think, a new complicating factor going forward.
Look, as complex as this is, I'm going to have to ask you the simplest, the simplest or shortest question, but the most complex answer. What does your gut tell you about how this is going to play out? Can you see a way forward through the complexity of these relationships, and given the early signals of al-Jawlani, or are we headed more in a Libya scenario or something, Afghanistan and others, where these things do break down and create a lot of openness to the return of some radical elements?
I think there's a possibility of things moving in a positive direction, but it really need a lot of coordination from the key players, and that's a role I think only the United States can play. And unfortunately, I'm not a fan of this current administration, but I think they're much better suited to play that type of coordinating role, where they would bring together and invest heavily in diplomacy, make sure that everyone is on the same page in terms of the future of Syria. That's what's fundamentally needed. But there's always spoilers that can sort of destroy this period of transition. One thing that I deeply fear is if ISIS, or even if former elements of the regime that have been toppled, or Iran and Russia want to sort of make things difficult, they can easily support the bombings or targeting or explosions in different cities that will completely sort of change what we're seeing right now. It would create chaos and confusion. We saw this in Libya. We saw this in Iraq after the 2003 invasion. We've seen this in Afghanistan after the return of the Taliban, when ISIS asserted itself. That's my big fear, that you're going to start to see these extremist groups either acting on their own or backed by different powers, creating chaos and mayhem. But I think there's an opportunity here, because no one thought that the Assad regime would be toppled. Nothing good could come out of that Assad regime. There was no chance for a better future. Now that that regime has sort of gone away, and it was toppled, luckily, by Syrians themselves. That's, I think, a good part of the story. Syrians liberated their own country. I wish it was a different movement. It wasn't these guys who were in power. But I think there's an opportunity here, and I think there's a big role that the international community can be playing to help Syria get back on track. And it's going to be a generation-long struggle, because you don't emerge from 54 years of political tyranny and transform yourself into Sweden or Denmark the next day, right? These are long-term political transformations in the best-case scenarios. But there's a role that the international community can be playing, and I do believe that the United States has an obligation and a leadership role that only it can play in trying to sort of coordinate these efforts.
I want you to end perhaps on Iran, because you mentioned clearly that Iran is no longer a player, could become a player again by fomenting violence. But what does this actually say about Iran going forward in the region, and thinking about, and there are many questions about a broader vision for the region in which Iran has always been and will continue to be a central player? How do you think this is going to affect Iran's behavior? Do they take this as a blow and turn inward? Do they go more nuclear, as one of the questioners asked? Where do you see this meaning for Iran?
Yeah, for Iran's national security strategy, the only logical move, from my reading, is to go nuclear, because they invested heavily in Assad and in Hezbollah as part of their national defense strategy. If ever there was a moment of crisis, if they feared an Israeli or American attack, they would rely on Hezbollah to sort of unleash its arsenal. Now that that's no longer an option, the only rational position that I see would be for Iran to go nuclear as having that sort of safety net from external intervention or attack. The problem, though, from Tehran's perspective, is as soon as they try and move that in that direction, they invite external scrutiny, attack. The political temperature goes up in terms of its relationship with the West. But these things are being debated right now in Tehran. And so I think That's how I see these things, evolving from Tehran's perspective. This is a major strategic feat for the Islamic Republic. They invested heavily for 45 years in Syria and in Lebanon, and now all of that has gone up in smoke. And there's no likelihood that that's going to be an opportunity for them to, re-engage with Syria or with Lebanon as they did in the past. So that's how I see it.
Well, that's a note to end on, one that should, of course, have us concerned. First of all, I really appreciate the broad perspective you brought to this very, very complicated context. A sense that there are some reasons for optimism and hope, given some of the early signals, but tremendous amount of risk that lead the United States, Turkey, and all the other players around the world to be thinking about how it can support this to move in the right direction. Thanks so much. Again, we'd like to keep this 30 minutes for those of you who are enjoying lunch or breakfast or dinner, no matter where you are around the world. We will be back in touch again with the next fast break, perhaps on Germany, given the latest crisis of the moment, or we may take a break and return after the holidays. But let me wish all of you a very happy holiday. And if I can do one last thing, which is to remind all of our SFS graduates that we have an alumni, Austin Tice, who has been held in Syria for 12 years. He is one of the longest serving hostages of any U.S. Citizen abroad. I know the Tice family who are here on our campus have been actively working with the U.S. government to try to seek his safe return, but I hope all of you will join us in praying for his safe return to his family and to our alumni community. Thanks all of you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again on our next Fast Break. Thank you.